They gave me a choice. That's what they called it, a choice. As if a man in magnetic restraints, sitting across a steel table from a government official who already knows the verdict, has any real options left. The room smelled like recycled air and institutional cleaning fluid, the kind that is supposed to smell clean but only ever smells like the idea of clean. Director Harlan was leaning back in his chair the way comfortable men lean when they know you're not. He had that face they all get, polished, patient, the face of a man who doesn't need to raise his voice because the walls do it for him. He was maybe 55, kept himself fit, had the particular stillness of someone who had been sitting in rooms like this one for a long time, on the comfortable side of the table, and had made his peace with the kind of work that required it. "You're going to Vault 7, he said, unless. I sat with that word for a moment. Outside the window there was sky, real sky, gray morning light over the city, low clouds with weather in them, the kind of light that makes everything look temporary. I remember thinking it might be the last time I'd see it at that angle, that low, that real. My name is Snow. For 6 years I worked for the Strategic Intelligence Branch, which is a long way of saying I did things governments need done and cannot admit to needing. Retrieval mostly. Moving pieces around a board that the public doesn't know exists. Getting into places, getting out of places, making sure that certain information moved between certain people without leaving a record of the trip. I was good at it for a long time. I was useful. And then I became inconvenient, which is a different classification entirely, and the distance between useful and inconvenient turned out to be substantially smaller than I had ever stopped to consider. I won't go into what I was accused of. The specifics are not the point. The point is that someone had decided a problem needed a shape, and my name fit the shape they needed, and here I was. A man named Frank had been killed in a hotel room 6 weeks ago, and the evidence said I had done it, and the evidence was very convincing, in the way that evidence becomes when sufficiently motivated people have assembled it. The truth was something else, and the truth was somewhere, and I had not yet managed to establish where. Harlan was talking. He was being careful about it, choosing his words the way a man chooses his steps in a room where the floor has been questionable. He explained the situation in the measured language of a briefing, not quite bureaucratic, not quite human, the tone that lives in the space between them. "There's a facility," Harlan said. "Platform 7, low Earth orbit, you know what it is." I knew. Everyone in the service who operated at my level knew. Platform 7 was the deep isolation wing, conceived and built in orbit for reasons that were partly engineering and partly political. Keeping certain categories of prisoner in ground-based facilities created specific problems. The mechanisms of due process, the inconvenience of legal representation, the continuous minor friction of a human rights infrastructure that had not yet been persuaded to look the other way entirely. In orbit, those frictions diminished. In orbit, 2,000 inmates could be maintained in stasis for indefinite periods, each one in an individual pod, the pods stacked in lattices that ran the length of the station's main block. You put them under. They stay under. No riots, no maintenance overhead, no quarterly legal review. Clean and efficient and thoroughly illegal under 6 international accords, which was why it had never officially been built. "There's been an incident," Harlan said. He said it the way you say a word you've been avoiding. Flat, even, no inflection. The word incident doing the work of a great many words he had decided not to say. The incident was this. A government inspector had gone aboard Platform 7 on a humanitarian verification visit. The visit was official, documented, the kind of oversight that exists in the architecture of these programs for liability management rather than genuine accountability. The inspector was a young woman named Emily Warnock. She was idealistic in the specific way that people are idealistic when they have not yet had the idealism worked out of them by sustained contact with the machinery they're trying to fix. She asked questions that she was not supposed to ask, and she had come prepared with access codes, obtained through proper channels by people who hadn't thought carefully enough about why she was asking for them. She had been aboard Platform 7 for 6 hours when everything went wrong. A prisoner in intake processing had gotten loose. One man, in a facility engineered to contain 2,000. How he managed it was something I would learn later, but the version Harlan gave me was sufficient. The man had found his way into the stasis control system, and he had opened every pod in the block. 2,000 inmates, awake, 3 hours before I sat in that room. Harlan slid a photograph across the table. Platform 7, main corridor, high-angle camera, image time-stamped at the 12-minute mark of the incident. The corridor was not a corridor anymore by that point. There were bodies. The guard complement had been 64. They had not had 64 seconds. "The inspector is alive," Harlan said. "Last confirmed visual 30 minutes after the incident began. She was being held in the medical bay, 3rd level. We have intermittent camera access. The population has been systematically destroying the monitoring infrastructure, but they haven't finished." "Send a strike team," I said. "We've evaluated that option." He folded his hands on the table. "The inmate population has barricaded the docking bays from the interior. Any breach attempt triggers secondary magnetic locks on all hatch mechanisms throughout the station. We could cut through hull, but the process takes—" He paused. He chose his next word. "Time. Sufficient time that the outcome for the inspector would not be recovery." I understood what he meant by that. "One man," Harlan said. "Small profile. The aft section has a maintenance port that isn't part of the secondary lock system. It was never integrated because the engineers classified it as non-critical access. You come in through that port. You find the woman. You get her to an escape pod. And what I get in exchange? Charges dropped, classification restored, full reinstatement if you want it." I looked at the photograph. I thought about Vault 7, which was the other half of the unless. I thought about what Vault 7 meant for a man in my particular situation. Not just the sentence, not just the years, but the specific nature of what they did to inconvenient people in systems that had never officially been built. And I thought about whether Harlan's offer was the kind of offer that gets honored. And I thought about Mace. Mace was my partner, had been my partner, before the same piece of machinery that had turned me inconvenient had processed him. His name was in the Platform 7 intake records, which was information I had obtained before my arrest through channels that I was not going to explain to Harlan. Mace had been trying to get certain information out before they buried him. Information that could dismantle the thing that had dismantled us both. He had a briefcase somewhere with documentation inside it, and the briefcase was locked, and Mace was the only person who knew the access code. Mace was on Platform 7. "All right," I said. Harlan nodded once, the way men nod when the calculation has resolved in the direction they wanted. He gestured to the officer at the door and the restraints loosened. "You'll be briefed on the approach." "I'm already briefed," I said. They launched me 3 hours later in a cargo module that would stop transmitting any identifiable signal the moment it crossed Platform 7's sensor perimeter. The module was small enough that I spent the transit with my knees drawn up, in the specific discomfort of a space that had been designed for cargo, and not for a 6'1" man with a sidearm and a comm relay, and more misgivings than he was willing to count. They gave me overalls that made me look like a maintenance contractor. They gave me a set of tools. They gave me, somewhat to my surprise, a reasonably complete layout of the platform's architecture. Nobody mentioned that the inmates would have had 3 hours with the systems before I arrived. Nobody mentioned the secondary security protocols that the inmates had apparently identified and repurposed. Nobody mentioned that the maintenance port they were sending me through had been partially welded shut from the inside, which I discovered when I got there. Which I mention because it bears on your understanding of how thoroughly the briefing had prioritized my successful launch over my successful arrival. But that comes after, First, there was the approach. Coming in on the hull of a structure like Platform 7 is a specific kind of loneliness. The mag boots give you purchase, but they give you nothing else. You are on the outside of something that exists to contain people inside it, in the dark, with the planet below you at a scale that the human visual system was not designed to process comfortably. The station's running lights were on automatic, cycling through their programmed intervals, indifferent to what was happening inside. Stars in every direction not blocked by the hull. The city grid of the eastern seaboard 200 miles down, ordered and geometric and remote, like a diagram of a civilization drawn by someone who had never actually lived in one. I moved along the hull in careful intervals. The mag boots are not quiet. They are not designed for silence. They are designed for grip in vacuum, which is a different engineering priority. I moved slowly and I kept my profile low, and I thought about the maintenance port and the weld and the cutting tool they had given me, which I now understood the purpose of better than I had when they put it in my bag. The port was on the aft section, 11 meters from the hull seam. I found it by layout memory and confirmed it by the slightly different surface texture of a panel that had been accessed more recently than its neighbors. Whoever had welded it had done a reasonable job under pressure. The weld was irregular but complete, no obvious stress fractures, a good seal. I looked at it for about 10 seconds, and then I got out the cutting tool and started working. 20 minutes. That is what it took. 20 minutes on the outside of a failing structure, in a suit that had not been designed for extended EVA, cutting through a weld laid by hands that had been frightened when they laid it, in total silence because there is no sound in vacuum, and I was alone out there in a way that the word alone does not quite reach. The panel opened inward. Inside, the air hit me first. Close, metallic, sharp. The smell of recycled atmosphere mixed with something that had no business being in a ventilation system, something organic and copper and recently produced. The maintenance corridor beyond the port was narrow, lit by a single strip of emergency yellow that had gone slightly orange with age. I pulled myself through, sealed the panel behind me, and stood up into the yellow light with my sidearm up. 50 meters in, I found the first body. Guard, male, mid-30s by the look of the hands. He had been running when it caught up with him from the position of him. I stepped over him and kept moving. Here is what I had been told about the population of Platform 7, in the efficient language of the briefing documents. 2,000 individuals, various classifications, maximum security designation. What the briefing language did not capture, because briefing language is not designed to capture it, was what 2,000 maximum security detainees actually represented in human terms. These were not people who had been put in the wrong place by chance or by bureaucratic error. Some of them had, yes, I was evidence enough that the mechanism could misfire, but the majority had arrived at Platform 7 by a different route. They were men who had been inside the apparatus long enough to know where the seams were, former intelligence operatives, former security contractors, former administrators of programs that had needed administrators until they didn't. Men who had been placed in stasis, not because they were dangerous in the conventional sense, but because they were knowledgeable, and knowledge in the wrong hands at the wrong moment is a specific category of threat that conventional security classifications don't adequately describe. 2,000 of these men awake, with 3 hours to organize. The man who had started it was called Veth. He was in the briefing as a risk classification, unstable, impulsive, a containment priority. What that translated to in practice was that Veth was the kind of man who sets a fire and then stands very close to it. Not stupid, he had managed, somehow, to get out of a sealed intake pod in a maximum security orbital facility, which is not a thing that stupid people do, but not strategic either. Veth's intelligence was kinetic and immediate, pointed in a single direction, and that direction was destruction for its own sake. He had been buried here because he knew things about certain programs that certain parties needed to remain unknown, and he had been buried in the specific way that suggests that the parties doing the burying were genuinely afraid. His brother was the one I was worried about. Rael, older, methodical, with an operational background that had covered most of a continent for 8 years before his inconvenience was formally noted. The briefing had less on Rael than it should have, which itself told me something. In the hours since the pods had opened, Rael had built a command structure from the available population, identified the men with useful backgrounds, established territorial control of the lower block, and locked the docking bays in a way that demonstrated a working knowledge of the platform's security architecture that he should not have had. He had also identified the hostages and their relative values within the first 30 minutes, which was how fast a man like Rael processes a room when the room suddenly matters. He had kept Emily Warnock alive and separated from the general population for reasons that he would explain to me later. I moved through the maintenance corridors for the first half hour, staying out of the main passageways, using the layout I had memorized to navigate a structure that was slowly becoming something other than what it had been designed as. The inmates had been thorough. They had dismantled camera infrastructure systematically, not randomly, not out of vandalism, but with the specific efficiency of people who understood what they were taking apart. They had established physical barriers at the main corridor junctions, improvised but solid. They had shut down or redirected ventilation in sections they weren't using, concentrating the working atmosphere in their controlled zones, which was an elegant piece of operational thinking that I noted and filed away. The lighting was partially down. The lower sections ran on emergency reds, which turned everything below the waist the color of old rust. The upper tiers were darker, some sections completely black, which told me the upper tiers were not being managed by anyone who thought carefully about resource conservation, which is to say, they were vets. I found Emily Warnock in the third-level medical bay. She was not in the condition I'd been told to expect, which is to say she was alive. Her left shoulder had been grazed, a bullet furrow rather than penetration, the wound treated with field-improvised bandaging that was clumsily applied but functionally correct. She had used the correct materials and the correct pressure in the correct location, which meant she had either medical training or very good instincts. She had positioned herself against the far wall with a clear sightline to the door, and she was holding a piece of medical equipment at face level when I came in. I stopped in the doorway and looked at the equipment. "Medical scanner," I said. "That's not a weapon." "I know," she said. She did not lower it. "But you didn't know that when you stopped." I considered this. She was right. I stepped inside. "Snow," I said. "I was sent to get you out by your father's people." She studied me with the specific attention of someone who has spent several hours deciding how much trust is available and has arrived at a very conservative number. The hours since the riot had done something to her face, not broken it, nothing like that, but compacted it, tightened the skin around the eyes, made something that might have been an open quality into something more careful. "How did you come in?" she said. "Aft maintenance port, welded from the inside but not thoroughly." She nodded, processing this. "There are perimeter men on the main corridors, Rail's organization. They're not random, they rotate, they communicate, they have designated response protocols. I watched them through a gap in the bay door for 2 hours before you arrived." "I know, I came through the maintenance shafts." "The other hostages." She shifted against the wall, her good arm taking the weight. "There were 12 of us total when the riot began. They moved us in the first hour, separated the group, took most of them to the lower block. I got separated in the movement and ended up here. I don't know where the others are now." "My job is you specifically," I said. "I understand that's your job." Her voice was measured. "I'm telling you that I will not leave this platform without knowing what happened to 11 other people." I looked at her for a moment. I looked at the medical bay, the supplies she had organized, the lines of sight she had identified, the position she had held for hours in a facility that was actively falling apart around her. I thought about what Harlan had said, and what Harlan had not said, and about the 60-40 calculation I was carrying. "Then we find them," I said. What Emily had found in the hours before the riot began was not what they had told her she would find. The verification inspection had been designed by the people who ran Platform 7 to produce a specific outcome, a clean report, a confirmation of compliance with the standards that the program was theoretically required to meet, a document that could be filed and forgotten and cited if questions arose. They had given her access to what they intended her to access, and arranged the visit to run through the sections that had been prepared for external observation. She had not stayed in those sections. She told me this while we moved in pieces, her voice low and level in the maintenance corridors, with one eye always on the passages ahead. She had obtained access codes for sections that were not on her approved list, through legitimate administrative channels, by asking questions that seemed procedurally routine but were not. She had found medical records, testing schedules, physiological data on inmates who had supposedly been in continuous stasis for periods far longer than any therapeutic or security justification could account for. She had found evidence of trials, pharmacological, neurological, long-duration experiments running on a population that had no knowledge of them and no recourse against them. The inmates weren't just being held, they were being used. "How much did you pull before everything went wrong?" I said. "Copies of 83 files," she said, "on a personal drive which is in my jacket pocket, which is still in my jacket pocket." "Good." "I assumed it mattered more than my comfort," she said. "I was right, I think." "You were right." We found the first group of hostages 40 minutes in, 2 of them, an administrative officer and a junior inspector, both unharmed, both in the state that people enter when sustained fear has burned through their adrenaline reserves and left something dull and cooperating behind. I gave them the relay's secondary frequency and the corridor designation from the layout, and told them to stay put. I transmitted coordinates to Harlan's channel, got an acknowledgement that was less than entirely reassuring, and kept moving. Emily said nothing about the 2 we left behind. She understood the math. The next group was harder to find because they had been moved more recently. Rails people had been shuffling the hostages periodically, a precaution against the kind of rescue operation I was running, and the redistribution had scattered them across 2 sections of the lower block. We found 3 more in a sealed maintenance room that someone had improvised a lock for with a section of structural pipe. All 3 unharmed, all 3 given the relay frequency and told to wait. 7 accounted for, 4 unknown. Veth found us on the return from the 3rd group. He came out of a cross passage with 2 men behind him, moving at the kind of speed that has stopped caring about whether there is anything worth running into. He was younger than his intelligence file suggested, late 30s, compact, with the loose-jointed movement of someone who has spent a great deal of time being physically formidable and is comfortable in that fact. His eyes had the particular quality of eyes that are running on something other than ordinary thought. Not madness exactly. More like a version of clarity that has decided most considerations don't apply. He saw me, and then he saw Emily, and then he grinned, which was not a comforting thing to see. I put Emily against the wall behind me and stepped into the corridor. What followed was not technically complicated, which is not to say it was comfortable. The man on Veth's left had a piece of structural tubing about 1 meter long and was not inexperienced with it. The man on his right had what I recognized as a restraint tool from the guard post, repurposed in a way that the manufacturer had explicitly not intended. Veth had something improvised from a panel lock that he was holding with confidence. I had a sidearm that I was not willing to discharge inside the station for reasons of attention management, and whatever else was available, and a particular institutional stubbornness that has gotten me out of situations that stubbornness alone should not have been sufficient for. I put the man with the tubing down first because he had the longest reach. The man with the restraint tool second, which was a closer thing than I would have preferred. Veth last, because Veth had committed to a course of action and was genuinely difficult to redirect even after the other two were on the floor, and it took longer than it should have, and I was aware throughout the process of Emily against the wall behind me and the sounds of the platform and the distance to the next corridor junction. None of them were dead. That was a choice, not an accident. An unconscious man in a side passage is a delay. A body in a corridor is a signal. I did not need to send any more signals than I was already sending. Emily helped me move them without being asked. "You've done this before," she said, "when we had them arranged." "More times than I'd like to count." "That's not the answer I expected." "What did you expect?" She thought about it genuinely, something that made it sound better. "It doesn't sound better," I said. "It sounds exactly like what it is. Can you move fast?" "Yes." "Then move fast." We found Mace in the lower block, in the section that Rail had designated as medical overflow, a converted storage room that someone had equipped with a cot and a minimal power supply, the kind of arrangement that suggests someone had thought about logistics, which confirmed what I already suspected about Rail's operation. Mace was on the cot. He was alive. That was the first and most important thing, and for the 2 seconds it took me to establish it, everything else in the room was irrelevant. He had been run through a number of stasis cycles. That much was visible without any medical equipment. The stasis damage has a specific presentation, a kind of hollowness to the face that isn't weight loss exactly, but looks like something has been subtracted. His hands were the same hands I remembered from 3 years of working alongside him, but they were still in a way that wasn't rest. And when I said his name, there was a delay before he looked at me that was longer than there should have been. But he looked at me. "Snow," he said. He said it the way you say a word that you've been keeping somewhere and are not entirely certain you'll get to say. "You look terrible." "You look worse." "I know." He sat up carefully, with the deliberateness of someone navigating inside their own body around obstacles. "Is this the rescue?" "Working on it." He looked at Emily. He took about 4 seconds to assess her, the way he had always assessed new variables, quietly, completely, without making a production of it. "The inspector," he said. "The same." "She found the files." "She did." Mace let out a breath that had more in it than just air. "Good," he said. "That's good." The windows came and went. That is the only way I know to describe the stasis damage. There were periods when Mace was entirely himself, sharp and precise and 3 steps ahead of the conversation. And then there were periods when he was somewhere else, talking to people who were not in the room, following a thread of reasoning that had its own internal logic but nothing to do with the present moment. In the clear periods, he gave me what he had been keeping. He gave me the location of the briefcase, a maintenance locker on level 4, behind a panel that had been relabeled to look like a ventilation access. He gave me the access code, not in sequence but in distributed pieces, the way he had memorized it, not as a string of characters but as 3 separate elements stored in different contexts in his memory, so that no single extraction session under stasis scan could pull the whole code. It was the most methodical thing I had ever heard from a man who was simultaneously managing his way through a fragmented cognitive landscape, and it was entirely Mace, and I was glad to be in the same room as him. "They've been running me for 8 months, he said, in one of the clear periods. Without particular emotion, roughly once every 3 weeks, they wanted the contacts list, the distribution chain for the documents. They got some of it, I couldn't keep all of it from them, but not the codes. The codes are enough." "I know," he looked at his hands. "I built the distribution to run without me after the first month. If I didn't check in, the copies would move. It's been moving." I looked at him. "How much is already out?" "Enough," he said. "The codes are for the confirmation layer. The documentation with the codes attached is the version that becomes legally actionable. Emily was listening. She had been quiet for a long time, and then she said, 83 files. I have them on the drive. Mace looked at her again. Something in his face shifted, not quite relief, which is too small a word for it. More like the acknowledgement of a debt he hadn't known he was owed. Then we have what we need, he said. We need to not die now. Working on that too, I said. Rail found us 20 minutes later, which meant he had been tracking us for longer than that and had chosen his moment. He came with 6 men, moving without urgency, the way a man moves when he has established to his own satisfaction that urgency isn't necessary. He was heavier in person than the intel file had suggested, with a stillness to him that had nothing to do with calm and everything to do with discipline. He looked at me first, then at Emily, then at Mace, and his assessment of what he was seeing took about 3 seconds and appeared to be complete. The man they sent, he said, not a question. One of us, I said, what do you want? He studied me. I want down, not immunity. I have no illusions about immunity. Passage to the surface and a 12-hour head start before any active warrants are filed, for myself and whoever among my people chooses to go orderly. He glanced at the ceiling, a brief upward flicker that took in the whole structure around us. The platform is failing. I don't intend to be on it when it stops failing. I can't authorize 12 hours. No, he said, but the inspector can get it authorized. Her word carries a weight in this situation that yours doesn't. He looked at Emily. Your word given to me directly, not through this man, not through channels, directly. Emily was quiet for a moment. She was looking at Rail with the same careful attention she had used on me in the medical bay. Reading him, the way you read something that you're not sure you can trust, but that you are in some sense obligated to engage with honestly. I'll carry your terms to my father's office, she said, personally, with my name on the request. I won't guarantee the outcome because I don't control the outcome, but I'll carry it. That's enough, Rail said. There's a problem, I said. He looked at me. His expression said he already knew what the problem was. Veth, I said. Rail's face did something controlled and interior. Yes, he said. He found us 40 minutes ago. He and 2 of his people are going to wake up angry. They're already awake, Rail said. He's been gathering the unaffiliated population for the last half hour, the men who have nothing to go back to. A pause. He's my brother. I know. I have been unable to manage this particular problem for the duration of my life, Rail said, with a flatness in his voice that was not a complaint, just an accounting. I don't expect to resolve it now. What happened next happened in the lower block's main corridor junction, which was where Rail's perimeter met the space that Veth's gathered population came through. Rail's 6 men held the line at the junction. I worked the corridor with what I had, which was my sidearm, 2 improvised implements from the storage room we'd passed through, the muscle memory of 6 years of this kind of work, and the particular advantage of operating in a space where the other side was not organized. Veth's people were not organized. They were agitated and numerous, and some of them had useful equipment, and most of them had conviction, but they did not have Rail's command structure, and they did not have any particular reason to be disciplined about the sequence in which they came at a problem. I used this. I used the corridor geometry. I used the fact that a narrow space rewards the single person holding it in ways that a wide space does not. Veth came at the end of the wave, which was either strategy or the natural behavior of a man who lets other people go first in situations where first is dangerous. He came with more intent than skill and more fury than either, and he was going to go through me to get to his brother. And the thing about Veth that I had understood from the moment I saw his file, and confirmed the moment I saw his face, was that there was no middle state available. You couldn't reason with what was driving him. You could only be in front of it or not. Rail stepped in front of him. I don't think it was a decision. I think it was the body doing what the body does when something moves towards someone you've been protecting your entire life, the response that arrives before the thought that would have second-guessed it. The shot that Veth had been aiming at me caught Rail in the upper chest, and Rail went down, and the corridor went very loud for about 30 seconds. I put Veth down at the end of those 30 seconds. He was alive. He was going to stay alive. Not out of any generosity on my part, but because a dead Veth in a corridor would have created a specific kind of memorial among the unaffiliated population, and an unconscious Veth in a corner created a different kind of situation entirely, one that the remaining population could decide about without my input. Rail's men secured the junction. I checked Rail, who was conscious, and had taken a hit that was serious but not immediately fatal if he reached medical attention within a reasonable window, which meant that the window was not here. "The pod bay," he said. His voice was flat with effort. "Go." "Your men." "My men know what to do," he said. "Go." I looked at him for a moment. "The inspector kept her word," I said. "So did you." He said nothing. He was managing pain with the same discipline he managed everything else, and I had no more time to stand there respecting it. The escape pod bay was on the platform's lowest tier, after the main block, behind a sealed pressure door that Rail's organizational efficiency had left functional while locking everything else. We reached it with Emily, Mace, and 2 of Rail's people who had attached themselves to us in the final corridor. Not assigned, not ordered, just men who had done the math on their own situation and decided to follow someone who appeared to be moving in a useful direction. The pod bay had 3 pods in the original configuration. One had been launched. The record said 40 minutes after the riot began, which meant someone with platform access and quick thinking had gotten out early, before Rail locked the bays. One had been damaged, deliberately, in a way that suggested Veth's people had made it to this section at some point and done what they did. One was functional. 1 seat. The pod bay's original purpose was emergency maintenance evacuation, minimum profile, single occupant, designed for the scenario in which a maintenance contractor needed to get off a failing station fast and alone. 1 seat. 1 control interface. 1 set of re-entry parameters preloaded for a surface landing. Emily looked at it. I looked at Emily. "Get in," I said. "There are still people." The relay coordinates are transmitted. Harlan has the locations of all confirmed survivors. The calculation is complete. I kept my voice even. "Get in the pod." "You knew," she said. She was looking at me with the careful expression from the medical bay, but something different in it now. "When they briefed you, you knew there was 1 seat." I didn't answer. "They sent you because you were expendable," she said. "If you got me out and didn't come back." "Get in the pod." "Snow." "Emily?" I said it the way you say something when you are not interested in the conversation continuing. "The platform is losing structural integrity. The window for a controlled pod launch is approximately 20 minutes. Get in the pod." She got in. She sat in the single seat and looked at the launch control, and then looked at the small viewport at the door of the pod, and she looked at me through it, and I could see her working through the same calculation I had been running since I stepped into the bay. She was thinking about the 7 people I had left at relay coordinates. She was thinking about Harlan's pause on the communication. She was thinking about the math of a man who had been sent here because the people who sent him could afford to spend him. She launched. I stood in the empty bay and listened to the pod separate and the silence it left behind. Mace was beside me. He had been quiet through all of it, managing himself, and now he said very calmly, "The maintenance locker on this level, the suits." I looked at him. "I put them there," he said, 8 months ago. One of the clear periods early on. I knew the platform's structural schedule. I knew what the long-term drift looked like." He met my eyes. 2 suits, external hull, re-entry window. We have maybe 15 minutes before the trajectory requires correction. I looked at the maintenance locker he was indicating. I crossed to it and opened it. 2 EVA suits. Old, the kind of old that is documented maintenance history and patchwork ceiling, and the general impression of something that has been kept functional by people who took their responsibilities seriously. Not new, not ideal, substantially better than the alternative. I looked at Mace. He was already moving toward the suits with the slow, careful deliberateness of a man managing around the damage inside himself. "You planned this," I said. "I planned for the possibility of this," he said. "There's a difference, but yes, largely yes." A pause. I had time to think. We suited in 4 minutes. The platform was making the specific structural sounds that mean a transition from stress to failing, and the sounds were accelerating in frequency in a way I didn't find encouraging, and there was no more time for anything except moving. We went out through the hull. Reentry in an EVA suit that was not designed for reentry is a precise category of terrible that I have no particular desire to revisit. The physics of it are simple. You are an object re-entering an atmosphere at orbital velocity, and the atmosphere has opinions about this, and the suit is the argument you are making against the atmosphere's opinions. The argument is not comfortable, and it is not quiet, and there are several points during it where the outcome is genuinely unclear. The heat builds first. That is the part that surprises people who haven't done it, the warmth, which is almost pleasant for the first 15 or 20 seconds, an enveloping warmth that makes you think perhaps this will not be so bad after all. Then the temperature climbs past pleasant into something else, and the light outside the visor goes from dark to a deep burnished orange, and the suit begins to make sounds it was not making before, and the pleasant assessment revises itself rapidly and completely. After the heat comes the drag. Orbital velocity meeting atmosphere means deceleration in a scale the body was not designed to process comfortably. The G-forces don't reach the levels of a combat maneuver, but they sustain, they hold. They press you into your own suit in a way that reminds you that gravity is not something that asks permission. The buffeting arrives about 40 seconds in, and it starts as a vibration in the extremities and becomes, over the following minute, something that involves the whole structure of the suit and the body inside it. The kind of vibration that makes thought effortful and holding correct position, a thing you do through will rather than proprioception. You can't steer exactly. You can influence in small ways the angle of your descent. You can hold the body position that gives you the best aerodynamic profile, and you can hold it with everything you have regardless of what the atmosphere is doing to you. I held it. I thought, with whatever cognitive function was available to me in the middle of all of it, about body position and entry angle, and the location of the city below me, and the basic math of whether we were going to arrive at the surface at a speed that a human body in a maintained suit could survive. The math was within acceptable parameters. Acceptable, in this context, meaning that the probability of survival was sufficient to make the effort of correct body position worthwhile. I kept one eye on Mace as long as I could track him, which was not as long as I would have liked. He was managing. I could see it in the body position, the controlled orientation, the practiced stillness of a man who is doing the right things with what he has. He had the body memory for this. In a better time, in a better program, before anyone had decided he was inconvenient, he had done EVA work as part of a specific assignment I was not supposed to know about and had known about anyway. He knew what correct position looked like and he held it, and somewhere around the 90-second mark, I lost visual on him in the light and the buffeting, and trusted that the math was doing the same work for him that it was doing for me. The suits held. Whoever had maintained them had done it correctly, had done it out of the kind of professional conscientiousness that exists independently of whether anyone is watching or whether the suits are ever expected to be used, and we were alive because of that person, whose name I will never know, to whom I owe a debt I can never pay. We came down over the eastern seaboard. We came down over New York, specifically, which has a tradition of receiving people who did not choose to arrive in it that goes back a considerable distance, and which received us in a park in the early morning, with the particular democratic indifference that New York reserves for the unusual. The suits took the impact, mostly. I came out of the canopy drag on one knee, in grass, with my hands on the ground and the smell of cold air and wet soil reaching me through the helmet seals, and it was the most specific and overwhelming thing I had experienced in some time. The smell of a planet, the smell of something that had been alive for a very long time, and that had not been recycled, and was not under management and was simply there. I got to my feet. Mace was 15 meters away, already standing, pulling his helmet release. Around us, dawn light, gray and thin and real, traffic somewhere in the distance, the normal sounds of a city that did not know what had just fallen through the sky above it. The government vehicles arrived 7 minutes later, 3 of them in convoy, moving with the efficiency of an operation that had been staged and was now executing. Men in tactical gear from the first 2. And from the third, a woman in a pressure suit who had apparently persuaded whoever had received her pod to drive rather than process. Emily Warnock walked across the grass toward me. She looked at me for a long moment, then she looked at Mace. Medical, she said. For him, immediately. Long-term neurological workup. Stasis damage, extended exposure. His name is Mace, and he is a material witness in a federal investigation, and he is to be treated accordingly. One of the tactical men started to say something about procedure. She looked at him until he stopped. Then she looked back at me. The 7 at the relay coordinates. Confirmed extracted, I said. Harlan's people, about 40 minutes ago. She let out a breath. And the others? I don't know about the others. I held her gaze. I know about the 7 I got to coordinates and the 2 who were with us in the pod bay. Rail's men. Yes. She nodded slowly, and Rail himself. Alive when I left him. He needs medical. I'll see to it. The tactical men had come up with restraints, which I had expected. I let them apply them without objection, because causing a scene at this particular moment would accomplish nothing, and I was tired in a specific and thorough way that had burned through the reserves that scene-causing requires. Harlan was not there. I had not expected Harlan to be there. The process that followed, the intake, the documentation, the formal and measured machinery of the situation being managed back into something the official record could describe, took most of that day and the following morning. I was held in a federal processing facility in the kind of room that is more comfortable than a cell, but less comfortable than anything else, and I was questioned by 3 separate sets of people who asked largely overlapping questions in slightly different orders, and I answered what I answered and declined to answer what I declined to answer, and I waited. On the second morning, Harlan came. He looked less comfortable than the last time I had seen him, which was a small satisfaction. He sat across the table, the same posture, the same stillness, but something had shifted in the weight distribution of the room, and we both knew it. The charges are being reviewed, he said. I know. There are considerations, he said, documents that have surfaced. Your associate Mace had certain materials in distribution. I know, I said again. Harlan was quiet for a moment. He was looking at me the way people look at things they have been attempting to control and have realized they cannot. It is not a comfortable look to be on the receiving end of. It is, however, preferable to the alternative. The inspector's documentation, he said, combined with Mace's chain of evidence, this creates a situation. Yes, I said. There will be an investigation. There should be. He sat with that. He looked at the table, and then he looked at me, and I think in that moment he was calculating things that went well beyond this conversation, calculations about exposure and accountability, and the specific mathematics of a situation that had gotten out from under the people who thought they were managing it. He did not look frightened, exactly. He looked like a man who is revising his models in real time, which is what intelligent people do when their models stop accounting for observed data. You understand that certain individuals who were associated with Platform 7's program will not be prosecuted. I said, I know. These things are complicated. Director, I said, I've been in this business long enough. I know how it ends. It ends with administrative notations and early retirements and a file that stops being actively pursued. I know. I looked at him. I'm not asking for a courtroom. I'm asking for the file to stop. He nodded once. And Mace, I said, full medical support long-term, everything they can do for the damage. His classification is cleared. His record reflects the original wrongful action. Another nod, and yourself. I told you what I wanted when I agreed to go. Yes, he said, you did. He left without saying anything else that mattered. That was 3 years ago. The charges were dropped within 2 weeks, not through a court, not through any process that produced a public record, but through the quieter mechanism of a file that stopped being pursued, an administrative notation added to a classification I will not have access to for at least 2 decades, and a morning when I walked out of a processing center with my possessions in a bag, and the winter light thin and cold on my face, and no particular instruction about where to go next. Emily Warnock filed her report. She filed it through channels that she had chosen carefully, to people who could not be administratively managed out of the obligation to receive it, and the documentation from Mace's distribution chain arrived through separate channels to corroborate it. What happened to the report after that is something I track from a distance. The investigations are slow and complicated, and will likely produce outcomes that are partial and unsatisfying. Some people have moved to different roles. Some have retired early. Some are still where they were, managing the management of the problem. None of them have been prosecuted in any sense that the word usually implies. This is how these things end. I knew that going in. But Emily Warnock is still asking questions. She was asking them before Platform 7, and she is asking them after, louder now, with better documentation and the specific authority of someone who has been shot at and survived it, and did not change her mind about any of the relevant things. I have the impression she will be asking them for a very long time. I have the impression she is the kind of person who does not find partial outcomes satisfying, and I find that I do not find this disappointing. Mace has a place on the coast, a small house, good light in the mornings, a deck that looks at the water. The stasis damage is not reversible in the complete sense. There are things it took that the doctors cannot put back, gaps in the continuous fabric of him that are simply there now and will stay there. But the windows of clarity have lengthened. The gaps have stabilized. On most mornings he is largely himself, sitting on that deck with his coffee, watching the tide move in and out over the rocks. He doesn't talk about Platform 7. I don't ask him about it. There are things that happen to him up there in the dark that belong entirely to him, and I have no right to any of it. I think about the moment in the pod bay when he said suits, the specific precision of it, the way the word arrived without ceremony, as if it had been waiting at the front of his mind for exactly that moment. Because it had been. 8 months in that place, running damage through the trials they put him through, and he had been planning, not hopping, not surviving by accident, but planning, distributing the access codes across his broken memory so that no single scan could pull the whole sequence. Putting the suits in the maintenance locker when he had a clear period and access, and a reasonable assessment of the platform's structural timeline. Building a way out for a situation he could not be certain would arise, because that was what he did, because that was who he was. They buried him there because he was inconvenient, because he knew things, because the people who run these programs needed him where they could keep him, and where they thought they could keep him meant somewhere without light, without communication, without any of the mechanisms that a person uses to be a problem. They forgot about the man who keeps the access codes in the broken pieces of his memory, who plans inside the damage, around the damage, through the damage, who waits for the right moment not because he believes in rescue, but because he believes in usefulness, and knows that usefulness requires patience, and has more patience than they gave him credit for. They always make that mistake. The people who design these systems, who run the programs, who decide that an inconvenient person can be managed by placing them somewhere with no exit, they always underestimate the specific human capacity to wait. Not hope, not faith, just the practical, stubborn, methodical refusal to accept that the current state is the final state, the willingness to hold what you know until the moment it can be used, and to trust that the moment will come. I did what I did because there was a woman in a medical bay who hadn't broken and had thought to bandage her own wound correctly, and had held a medical scanner at face level for the same reason she did everything else, because it was the best available tool for the situation. I did it because there was a man on a deck somewhere who had earned the right to drink his coffee in the morning and watch the water. I did it because the people who sent me expected to spend me, and I find that expectation, in any form, thoroughly motivating. That's all it was. That's what it's always been. We're not special. We don't have larger guns or faster ships or harder bodies. What we have is the thing they never quite account for, the capacity to take the loss, catalog it, set it down, and keep working. The capacity to be used up and not be used up completely. To be broken in the specific ways they've learned to break us, and to keep something back. Something small, something patient, something that waits in the maintenance locker for the moment when it will be exactly what's needed. They'll learn, eventually. They always think they've learned, and they always haven't, quite, because the thing that makes us difficult to finish is the same thing that makes us difficult to fully understand. You have to have been the one holding the access codes in the dark to know what that feels like. You have to have been the one who looks at a room that has every advantage over you and thinks, not yet, but eventually, and means it. They never quite learn that. I walked out of that processing center into the winter light, and I didn't go back to the service. I didn't need to. The file was closed. That was enough. But on the mornings when I see Mace on that deck, watching the water come in, I know what it cost. I know the specific price of being the kind of person who holds on. It is not a small price. It is not something you come back from entirely. He is more than what they left him, and he is less than what he was, and somewhere in the distance between those two things is the truth of what was done and what it meant. He drinks his coffee. He watches the water. On the good mornings he laughs at something I say, something he remembers, something the light does across the rocks. That's what was worth it. That was always what was worth it.